Okay, so when we talk about the view that of the tradition that I follow, which is the Buddhist tradition, and in terms of what we are, what our inner being or transcendent being is, our true being, I think it's called, no? Then we have to talk a bit like that there is a sense of transcendence, even though we now live completely confined to our human experience. There is something of our nature that transcends our human experience. That is not something that will develop deliberately and then it will become like the product of our spiritual practice. We cannot make it. And it is not something that will come in the future. But now then we have to live this human experience up to whatever it lasts, and only then we will transcend. That will not possible to discover that kind of inner being which transcends our human experience. It's not like that. Like what Buddha or the Prince Siddhartha better said, discovered at the moment of enlightenment, is that what he called Buddha nature. Well, he didn't call it Buddha nature, I don't think so, but what he found is that this absolute nature, like the transcendent, or this nature of all beings who have consciousness, is totally enlightened. Enlightened meaning that it is perfect, it is infinite. The sublime qualities are completely perfect right there, and in their infinite kind of expression, this infinite compassion, infinite altruism, empathy, loving kindness, and also wisdom, and so forth. But that applies not only to human beings, it also applies to animals as well, and also other beings we do not have contact with right now. But that means to say that it's something that is common to every single sentient being. It is not something that belongs only to Buddhists. I mean, Buddhists don't have a copyright on that. And it is actually like the nature of reality. Not only also the nature of consciousness, but even further, it is like the nature of the whole universe as well, which is a bit more difficult to understand. But anyhow, that is more or less what he expressed. So having said that, then we are now human beings. And as a human being, we last, a certain number of years. Of course, we are not permanent totally and, eternal. We live as much as our life goes. And so therefore, our human life is really something which is quite temporary in the sense of what we experience. Right now, we can say, well, the way I experience myself is as a human being, but actually, what am I? Am I really, that's all I am? Is it that? Only a human being and a human experience with my emotions, my history, my traumas, my hang-ups, or all these different aspects that form me as a person, including my body, including my sensations, and so forth. Is that all there is? Or what am I in an absolute level? What am I? So when Buddha speaks that our basic nature is Buddha's mind, or like this Buddha nature, that means to say that we've always been Buddha, not the historical Buddha. Buddha in this case is literally, it means the awakened. We have an awakened nature, awakened from the sleep of ignorance, and also awakened and freed from all kinds of distortions. So that means to say that we have always been a Buddha, we are right now a Buddha, and we will always be a Buddha. That's what makes it that our basic nature is unconditioned, it is uncompounded, it is that is according to the view and what Buddha discovered, that's the way we are. So then the whole thing is that it is immediate. We can always discover that. It's not something that we may see after so many lifetimes, or we may see after death only, when I die, and if I do my things right, then I may have access to that nature, but that may happen. But also, it is possible to contact that nature because it is always present. It is always present in anything we do, in anything we perceive, in all our emotions, in all our knowing, the things we think about, even in our negative emotions, because everything comes from that basic source, which is our enlightened nature. The only problem, which is a big problem, is that we are not aware of that. And in one way, it's quite simple, but on the other way, it's not so easy to tackle that problem, because actually, we've always been like that. And let's talk about this life. I mean, we were born, and why we repeated this kind of unknowingness since childhood. I mean, when a child is born, the child has a very kind of naked mind, in the sense that they have not built up any kind of concepts about good, bad, short, whatever. I mean, their minds are very close to the nature of their being, to the nature of mind. But then, why is it that the first contact that they have with some kind of reality that appears, obviously it will be the mother, and also, the feeding and the breast and so forth, they will start to perceive it as something external. Nobody taught a child to perceive that as something external, but it always happens that way. It has happened that way with us, and that's the way it happens. So why is it that consciousness reacts in that way, in which as soon as there is an event, cognitive event, even at the basic level of a child, newly born child, then duality between subject and object sets in, and from there, then it becomes more complicated, because then reification comes, and the whole world that we know of myself and other is set in. And that's where we are always living. We are always living within that type of duality of me and other, and myself and other beings and so forth. And basic separateness then starts there. It actually starts before. It starts before, but it's not conscious, it's not operative, but it is in the way of habitual patterns. No? Now, of course, I have to refer to the view of Buddhism that this is not the only life that we have. We come with a backlog of the different lifetimes from before, in which we always perpetuated this system of again and again repeating the dualistic perception. So that stands there, and that will influence that basic consciousness to act in that way without even willing to do so. Even us, I mean, now we're developed, we already have piles of education, like primary, secondary, like whatever, college, and we became kind of quite elaborate beings. And yet, even if we want to revert that duality, because we come to an understanding through analysis and logic and realizing that there is nothing that can validate this duality, saying that I exist like in an independent way, like in a concrete way, and therefore because of that belief, automatically there is an other who also exists in an independent and concrete way. That is how all of us, I think, maybe, I don't know, I'm too brash, including the whole audience, but I think that most of us, perceive it that way in terms of myself and other beings. So the thing is that we cannot decide. It's not that one morning I will wake up and then I will say, okay, today I will not be dualistic. I mean, it would be great. It would be great, like a New Year resolution, like all this year I will be. And then, okay, well, next year I will, be. It doesn't happen that way. I mean, we need some system to correct something that really distorts our perception in an instant. It really gains us over all the time. We don't even notice. We are completely set in to that mindset of duality. So when we talk about our basic being, the Buddha, you know, he kind of doubted, because he said, well, this is something so transcendent that I cannot explain it. But then he was asked to teach and so forth. So finally, he said a few words, but all the time warning us that the words do not make the actual nature of what he was describing with words. Because basically, one of the main problems of our basic being or our Buddha nature, it is that it is beyond words and beyond concepts, and is also beyond description. So one would say, because we are always confined to the intellect, that then we cannot know it. Everything we know now is based on concepts, it's based on words, it's based on ideas, it's based on thoughts and all kinds of things that we build up, and therefore we have knowledge, and we can say that we built up a new knowledge that did not exist before. But how can we know something that transcends words and transcends also the concepts and ideas and thoughts? But still he gave us some kind of guidelines, and he said that, Sabsi Todero said Dumache, in Tibetan, Sapa means to, it is profound. He's the most, I think, like something that we have to be quite happy about is that he said, but still it can be known. Even though we cannot know it with our intellect, it can be known. But we have to change our perception. We have to change our way of cognizance, our way of knowing. Can we do that? The good news is that we can do that, because the mind is not some kind of block that never changes. Mind is a continuous flux of instants of consciousness. So we can drive that mind and create a space for that mind to recognize its own Buddha nature. And in that way it can change. It can know beyond the intellect also, that possibility. But if we hadn't had someone who could tell us clearly, you can do it, and it can be done, and I've done it, and there is a path that I can show you to do it, then we would not have a system, and it would be always like difficult for us to discover that, because we don't have the means, we don't have the tools. So he said it's profound. Profound means that we cannot know it with the intellect. We have to go further in our consciousness. We have to transcend somehow the way that we habitually know things. And then it also says it is peace, and that is fantastic. That means to say that we have, because our true nature is peace, it means to say it's free from conflict. And free from conflict means well-being, means happiness. That is our birthright, to like a way of saying it is like we basically are, I wouldn't say happy, but I mean, you know, there is an experience of well-being that belongs to us at our most deepest kind of basic level, because we own, that is what we essentially are. And then the third thing he said is that it is free from any kind of conceptual elaboration. We cannot say, okay, now, you know, when we know something, then immediately we pigeonhole it and we say, well, then this exists, but this does not exist. And, you know, we immediately need, our intellectual way of knowing needs to place things in different pigeonholes. Otherwise, it cannot really make all the connections to form ideas and so forth. So, but you cannot say that. You cannot say that it exists, but then you cannot deny it also. And you cannot, there's no other possibility. It's beyond any kind of definition. So that is an important point, of course, because it has to do with the absolute level of truth that I will refer to. I don't know if I have enough time. The clock goes very fast, but
I'll give you a few if you pay me.
And then he said, so in that way, you know, it is like space, because space, you cannot say anything about space. You cannot say that it exists, but I mean, if space were not here, we couldn't even move. We couldn't, I mean, space, but it cannot, you cannot say it exists. There's nothing that can identify space. But unlike space, then mind knows, so it is luminous. That means to say that Buddha nature is cognizance. Buddha nature is primordial wisdom. Buddha nature is something that enlightens everything. It is cognizant and it is also luminous. And then finally, that it is uncompounded and it is not conditioned. That means to say, it will never be a product of our good practice, or we follow the path, and then we have constructed this enlightenment that did not exist before. There's nothing new. We just discover what we've always been and what we'll always be, which is our essential being of Buddha nature. But then where are we now at? I mean, because we don't experience that. So Buddha really explains two levels of truth. And right now, we are unaware of that. What is the result of the second one, which is that you cannot say that it exists or it cannot exist. So myself, we, each of us, perceive ourselves as something that really exists. That is to say that the mind, when perceives that kind of essential nature, mistakes it and assumes the idea of an I. Now, I is okay, we have an I, but it's not that real, solid I that we all experience. The problem is that the moment we have the I, that means then we reify it. And reify means we assign a reality on something that by its own nature does not have it. And our I does not have that nature. Our I doesn't, it's just like this assumption, and it is a wrong assumption. We have reified our I. Actually, what we are is this essential being, which is free from any kind of identification, but still we have a very strong sense of identity. But once we have set up the I, then we set up the other. So then already we started with the duality. And the duality brings about all kinds of reifications. The whole world seems to us like real. When we suffer, then we really suffer. When we are dying, then we really die. When someone dearest to us dies, also really dies. Everything appears to us as real. Even when we dream, dreams also appear to us as real. That's why we have nightmares, or we have a joyful dream, and so forth. So this reification is really what binds us constantly to samsara, or to this world, conditioned by suffering and ignorance. And the problem is that it comes with every instant of consciousness. It's so deep that we need a system, we need something that trains the mind to increase its own lucidity, clarity, to detect that and go beyond it and destroy reification. And in that case, then, this same mind, which actually it is an expression of my Buddha nature, that is coming, that whole cognitive immensity of Buddha nature, it is coming through the whole structure, false structure of ego, the I, the emotions, and the negative afflictions, and so forth, then turns into this intellectual cognizance, intellectual knowing, and all the kinds of emotions, bad emotions that we may have, like jealousy, pride, and so forth. In essence, we never left our Buddha nature. And in essence, Buddha nature is expressed in anything we perceive. We need to develop that ability to perceive it in anything that appears and that we experience. And that ability is what is taught in the Buddhist path. So that is why Buddhism, or the Dharma of Buddhism, is considered to be a method. That's all it is. The Dharma is something that will, as they say, once you cross the river with a boat and you reach the other shore, you don't take the boat with yourself. You just leave it. And then that is what the Dharma is also. It's like you use it and brings the mind to its own nature, and then we become totally in tune with our basic being, our enlightened state. And then relative reality starts to also reflect that kind of perfection in our actions, in our thoughts, in our perception, in everything. Well, how will that be? I don't know. I run out of time, so we can talk about that.
Thank you. You're describing this, this long habituated process where underneath it all is the Buddha nature, that is our birthright, that is uncontestable, that has always been there and always will be there. And then there's layers of misperception on top of that, and has been for, you said that there are multiple lifetimes that are contributing to this habitual pattern that, if you go back lifetime to lifetime to lifetime, all the way back to the beginning of life, nearly 4 billion years, or the beginning of the planet, 14 billion years, that's a lot of habit.
Yeah.
And now we're living in this moment. We talked last night about the threshold moments, the pivots. And we're living in this moment where all the faith traditions are pointing toward this, right, in one way or another. And Buddhism has been laid out a science for this, as has other traditions. Buddhism for 2,500 years, although I've been hearing that for the 35 years I've been studying Buddhism. So 2,535 years at least, been pointing.
60.
And yet the habit continues. And I wonder if you imagine that at some point, with all of everything pointing toward this, and many, many more people in practice, do we reach a point where we have a consciousness threshold where everybody's habit can change at the same time? Or what's our hope in this?
Oh, everybody's consciousness changes at the same time.
I don't know. I'm just wondering, how do we get over the undertow of this habit? You hang out with folks who have done a lot of practice.
It is, yeah. It is, well, I've done a lot.
You've done a lot of practice
much,
yourself?
But it is an individual path, actually. What we change is our perception or our experience. Anything that we do as practice, or what we call practice, different, all kinds of practices. Buddha taught many, many practices. They are all aimed at, first, to recognize that the nature of mind or the nature of our being, and then, well, the techniques can be very sophisticated and so forth, but that reflects in our perception. Anything we do in the path reflects on our perception. And our perception right now is extremely conditioned by habit. All habitual patterns. That's all I would even go further and say that if you try to find some entity behind all this mass of habitual patterns that controls our perception, and nobody has imposed those perceptions, those habits on us. We have created it, and we keep creating them instant to instant because we perpetuate duality and also reification. So, but if we try to find some kind of entity behind these habits, it's difficult to find, That means to say that there is some kind of mere identity behind it, but not really a solid identity. So the only way is not that we change our perception. When we change our perception, then also as a reflection, the other people will be inspired, like the inspiration we get from masters, that are in the continuity of that basic knowing, transcendent knowing, and they manifest the qualities that are also quite special, qualities of compassion, wisdom, and so forth, and they inspire us to also emulate them, and like that. So, then we can inspire others through our realization, but we cannot really go around and change people because it's very difficult to change ourselves. Imagine to change other people, right? So in that way, interconnectedness or interdependence is a complete result of this absolute truth that I was talking, that you cannot say, nothing has an intrinsic identity. Therefore, everything still appears. But why does it appear? It appears because they are all interdependent to each other. Things arise from causes and conditions. There's nothing that does not arise from causes and conditions. Even like when you talk about right, then it's because it depends on the left. It's not that left or right arose from the causes and conditions of each, but it's just like that. This whole way of that we experience at the relative level. Then, as a result of knowing and living the absolute level, everything is seen as this interbeing or interconnected. I had to use the word, because that's the subject matter.
Thank you. Thank you. My mind is a little blown. Any quick questions for Gerardo from the others on our panel, or we can save it for a broader dialogue?
I'm just finding myself thinking a little bit about my favorite Bishop Catherine story, and I hope it's a true story because if Bishop Catherine's in the audience, but as it was told to me, there was some general convention in which a sermon was preached by aforementioned bishop who said there was no such thing as individual salvation. And well, this was quite startling, enough to get the House of Bishop to rock on its heels a little bit. Our whole practice system is based on it. What about sin, penance, confession of sin? But the point is that if you have a religion in which the mark of salvation, as they call it in Christianity, is the capacity to love your neighbor as yourself, then there can be no individual salvation, because it exists as essentially, if you want to push the language all of a sudden, it's an emergent property of the field. Well, I found myself wondering that same thing as you spoke about Buddha nature. It may be that the confusion that keeps running through so much of this, and the difficulty for so many people in the habits, is that we keep thinking about realizing my Buddha nature. But there is no my Buddha nature if there is only Buddha nature, and from some different perceptivity we get to jump into it and dance in it. I don't know, but it's from the point of view, are we using individual filters to talk about something whose identity can only be realized at a level of realized interbeing? Just a question.
This individual salvation, in some of the teachings of Buddhism, then one aspires to the individual salvation. But actually, like most of the teachings of Buddhism, they speak very much about, yes, you may have an individual salvation, but together with that comes like an unlimited compassion that then forces you to completely, not forces you, but I mean it's completely automatic, then you can never leave anybody behind. So therefore you work also to help other beings to realize that freedom that you had found. But there's nothing wrong in talking about an individual salvation, because unless you are already transcendent, the ignorance kind of, or this unawareness of Buddha nature, then you cannot speak of oneself of being free. We are free when we are not dominated anymore by habits. When we have overcome the dualistic habits, then we can say that we are free. And that means to say that then that freedom, you don't keep it for yourself. You use it because you found the right path that leads to that, and therefore, it's not that you love others like yourself, you even love others more than yourself somehow. In the training of compassion, you develop that type of compassion. So one keeps on working and working and working.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Now, also when you say about Buddha nature, it is actually one thing that we have to, Buddha nature is kind of, like if you take, for instance, a mirror, then you have to view it like one taste, in the sense that everything is has the one taste of Buddha nature. Then that means to say that a mirror, for instance, can have 1,000 different images in it.
Yeah.
But the essence of each image is Buddha nature. Exactly. But that does not mean that each image has their own kind of shape or identity, somehow like that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good, thank you.